By the time a green hydrogen project reaches serious planning, most teams believe they've solved the hard part once electricity is secured. A PPA is signed, renewable generation is identified, pricing is locked, and the spreadsheet finally balances. At that point, the assumption is simple and rarely questioned. If electricity exists and has been paid for, it will be available when needed. But that assumption is quietly false. Long before cost, before electrolyzer efficiency, before hydrogen storage or offtake contracts, green hydrogen runs into a more basic obstacle. The grid does not treat all loads equally, and hydrogen almost never sits near the top of that hierarchy. Electricity grids are not neutral marketplaces where electrons flow to whoever pays the highest price. They are physical systems designed first for stability, safety, and continuity of essential services. Every grid operator, whether in North America, Europe, or Asia, operates under a priority logic that determines who keeps power when the system is stressed. These rules are rarely discussed in hydrogen presentations, yet they decide whether an electrolyzer runs at 80% utilization or 30%. They decide whether a project clears final investment decision or quietly stalls. And they decide, in practice, whether green hydrogen is treated as essential infrastructure or as optional demand. To understand why hydrogen is pushed to the back of the line, it helps to understand how grid operators think. Organizations like PJM Interconnection, ERCOT, and ENTSO-E are not optimizing for hydrogen output or decarbonization targets. Their mandate is reliability. Frequency must stay within tight bounds. Voltage must remain stable. Critical services must not fail. When congestion, weather events, equipment failures, or sudden demand spikes occur, grid operators do not ask which load has the best long-term economics. They ask which loads must remain powered to prevent cascading failure. Hospitals, emergency services, residential demand, water treatment plants, and increasingly data centers occupy the highest tiers of priority. These loads are considered essential because losing them creates immediate harm. Industrial loads are evaluated differently. Within that category, some facilities earn higher priority because they provide continuous process operations where interruption causes equipment damage or safety risk. Steel furnaces, chemical plants with continuous reactors, and certain refineries fall into this group. Green hydrogen electrolyzers generally do not. Electrolyzers are, from the grid's perspective, flexible loads. They can ramp up and down quickly. They do not provide essential services to the public. They do not typically cause immediate safety risks if curtailed. In fact, their flexibility is often marketed as a grid benefit. Hydrogen developers frequently argue that electrolyzers can act as controllable demand, soaking up excess renewable power when it is abundant. That argument is technically correct, but it comes with a consequence that is rarely acknowledged. Flexible loads are the easiest to cut, and in grid logic, easy to cut usually means first to cut. This is where priority rules quietly undermine hydrogen economics. During congestion events, grid operators must shed load to protect the system. They start with non-essential, interruptible, or contractually flexible demand. Electrolyzers almost always fall into this category. Even when a project has a long-term PPA, the physical reality of the grid can override contractual intent. If transmission capacity is constrained, if voltage support is needed elsewhere, or if stability is threatened, hydrogen loads are curtailed because they are allowed to be curtailed. The result is a mismatch between financial assumptions and operational reality. Financial models often assume steady access to power because a PPA exists. Grid operations assume the right to interrupt power because the load is classified as flexible. Both sides believe they are correct, and neither side is lying. The conflict emerges because PPAs are financial instruments, not dispatch guarantees. They do not elevate a load's priority in the physical hierarchy of the grid. This distinction becomes even more important as renewable penetration increases. Wind and solar generation introduce variability that grid operators must constantly manage. When renewable output spikes beyond local demand and transmission capacity, curtailment occurs. Hydrogen is often positioned as a solution to renewable curtailment. In practice, hydrogen becomes entangled in the same congestion dynamics. If the electrolyzer sits behind a constrained node, it may be unable to absorb excess power even when generation is available. If it sits elsewhere, it may be curtailed to relieve congestion caused by renewable inflows upstream. In both cases, priority rules decide outcomes, not hydrogen demand. Batteries illustrate the contrast clearly. Grid-scale batteries are often granted higher dispatch priority because they provide fast frequency response, voltage support, and ancillary services that directly stabilize the grid. They are not just loads, they are grid assets. Hydrogen electrolyzers, by contrast, are treated as consumers. Even when hydrogen advocates argue that electrolyzers can provide grid services, most market designs do not compensate or recognize them in the same way. The grid rewards assets that help maintain stability. It penalizes loads that can be deferred. This structural bias shows up most clearly during system stress. Heat waves, cold snaps, storms, and equipment failures force grid operators into emergency modes. During these events, discretionary loads are shed aggressively. Hydrogen projects that looked robust on paper suddenly experience prolonged downtime. Capacity factors drop. Hydrogen output falls. Revenue projections collapse. Yet none of this appears as a dramatic failure. There is no explosion, no equipment breakdown, no regulatory shutdown. The project simply underperforms quietly month after month until the economics no longer justify continued operation or expansion. Developers often respond by adding buffers to their models. They reduce assumed utilization from 95% to 85% or from 80% to 70%. But this is not a linear adjustment. Below certain thresholds, hydrogen economics break non-linearly. Fixed costs dominate. Capital recovery stretches. Financing terms worsen. Off-takers lose confidence. What began as a grid priority issue becomes a financial viability problem. Some projects attempt to escape this trap by going behind the meter. They co-locate electrolyzers directly with renewable generation, hoping to bypass grid congestion and priority rules entirely. This strategy can work in narrow circumstances, but it introduces new constraints. Behind-the-meter systems lose access to grid balancing services. They must overbuild generation or accept downtime during low renewable output. They face permitting challenges, land constraints, and often higher effective power costs. The priority problem is not eliminated, it is relocated. Others pursue hybrid strategies, combining grid power with on-site generation and storage. These systems are complex and capital-intensive. They require sophisticated control systems and careful coordination with grid operators. Even then, during major system stress, grid interconnection agreements often still grant operators the authority to curtail exports or imports. Priority rules reassert themselves at the worst possible moments. The deeper issue is that hydrogen occupies an ambiguous position in today's energy system. It is not yet essential infrastructure, it is not yet fully integrated into grid service markets, and it is not yet protected by policy frameworks that elevate its priority during dispatch. Until that changes, hydrogen will continue to be treated as optional demand. Optional demand is valuable when the system has excess capacity. It is expendable when the system is tight. This reality explains why so many green hydrogen projects struggle to move beyond pilot scale. At small scale, curtailment and downtime are tolerable. Grants and subsidies absorb inefficiencies. At industrial scale, priority rules become binding constraints. The grid does not scale its generosity with project ambition. It scales its discipline with system risk. From a systems perspective, this is not a failure of grid operators or hydrogen developers. It is a mismatch of expectations. Hydrogen projects are designed as if electricity were a commodity delivered on demand. Grids operate as if electricity were a shared resource governed by hierarchy and risk management. Until hydrogen planning internalizes that hierarchy, projects will continue to underperform relative to their models. This is why conversations about green hydrogen that focus only on electrolyzer costs, renewable prices, or future demand miss the point. The first-order question is not how cheap hydrogen can become, but how reliably it can access power within real grids under real conditions. Priority rules answer that question long before cost curves do. Understanding these rules also reframes the debate about hydrogen's role in the energy transition. Hydrogen works best where it aligns with grid incentives rather than fighting them. Industrial clusters with stable baseload demand, dedicated generation, and limited congestion offer better conditions than highly saturated renewable regions with constrained transmission. Markets that explicitly value flexible demand in ways that preserve utilization offer better prospects than those that simply shed load during stress. As the hydrogen economy evolves, some of these dynamics may change. New market designs could reward electrolyzers for providing grid services. Policy frameworks could elevate hydrogen's priority in specific contexts. Infrastructure investments could relieve congestion, but none of these changes are automatic, and none of them are guaranteed. For developers, investors, and policymakers, the implication is clear. Green hydrogen is not blocked primarily by technology. It is constrained by systems, and among those systems, grid priority rules are among the least visible and most decisive. At this point in the series, this is where ReneEnergy directs attention toward deeper systems analysis. Not as a product pitch, but as a place where grid access, utilization risk, financing structure, and execution constraints are examined together rather than in isolation. Hydrogen succeeds only when these layers align. When they don't, the grid decides the outcome long before the market does. In the next video, we will push this logic further and examine how curtailment risk compounds over time, why it is systematically underpriced in hydrogen models, and how it quietly destroys project economics, even when everything else appears to be working.